Have you ever lost track of time, only to realize hours have passed in a blink? What if something was stealing those moments from you, pulling them out of your memory forever? For 40 years, the official story is that a team of mappers simply vanished into the desolate, Siberian snow. But now, the lone survivor is finally talking. He remembers a vast, white wasteland where the silence itself felt hungry, and a geological anomaly that didn't just kill his colleagues, it unwrote them from existence. So glance at a clock. After hearing this, you'll start to question every minute you can't quite account for. We've all heard the stories about Area 51, right? The whispers of crashed saucers and secret hangars baking under the Nevada sun. But what if the most terrifying secrets aren't guarded by soldiers and fences? What if they're protected by something far more effective, sheer, empty distance? I recently made contact with a man named Alexei Volkov, and the story he told me has nothing to do with American deserts. It takes place in the 1980s, in the heart of Siberia, during the top-secret Soviet project so remote, so ambitious, that what they found out there wasn't just buried, it was erased from the maps entirely. In the summer of 1983, Alexei Volkov was just 24 years old. He wasn't a spy or a soldier. He was a geodetic engineer, a mapmaker, fresh out of the Moscow State University. He was brilliant, ambitious, and a true believer. A believer in science, in progress, and in the grand vision of the Soviet Union. He told me he saw himself as an architect of the future, helping to chart the very last frontiers on Earth. When he was selected for a classified expedition called Operation Meridian, it wasn't a punishment. It was the honor of a lifetime, a chance to put his name on a piece of the world no one had ever measured before. The mission was simple on paper, but monumental in scale. They were to be flown deep into the Yakutian taiga, a region larger than most European countries, and conduct a comprehensive geodesic survey. They were a small, elite team of 4. Viktor Orlov, the leader, was a stern, by-the-book veteran of other remote projects. Dmitry Lisko was the lead cartographer, a man who was quiet, meticulous, and obsessed with precision. And then there was Yuri Sokolov, the radio operator and general handyman, a boisterous joker who kept spirits high. Alexei said that in those first days, they felt invincible. They were young, they were the best at what they did, and they were united by a powerful sense of purpose. Imagine being set down in a place where the very concept of a road doesn't exist. Where the silence is so total, it feels like a physical weight pressing on your eardrums. That was the Yakutian taiga, an endless, rolling sea of stunted larch trees, bogs, and moss-covered earth. The ground itself was permafrost, frozen solid for thousands of years, hard as concrete just a few inches below the surface. Alexei spoke of its beauty with a kind of reverence. The pale, 24-hour sun of the Arctic summer, the air so clean it felt like drinking ice water. He said it felt like landing on another planet. A pristine world, untouched by human hands. A perfect, frozen, orderly place. Or so they thought. The first 3 weeks were exactly what they had trained for. They set up a base camp, 4 canvas tents, a fire pit, and a radio mast. Each day they would trek out in pairs, carrying the heavy survey equipment, leapfrogging across the tundra to establish their grid. It was grueling work. The air was cold, the ground was hard, and the mosquitoes were relentless. But there was a rhythm to it, a comforting logic. Take a measurement, write it down, move to the next point. The world was reducible to numbers, to angles and elevations. In his testimony to me, Alexei called it, with a voice thick with sadness, the last good summer. It was the final moment of his life when the world still made sense. The change came on the 23rd day. Alexei and Dmitry were miles from camp, running a new survey line due east. They were moving through a relatively flat, open area of tundra when Dmitry stopped dead. He just stood there, staring at the ground ahead. Alexei followed his gaze, and he saw it. In the middle of the frozen, brittle landscape was a perfect circle. About 30 meters across, it wasn't a crater from an impact. There was no debris. The ground wasn't burned. It was simply wrong. The hard, icy permafrost gave way to a circle of dark, wet, steaming mud. Alexei took a hesitant step forward, knelt down, and touched it. The ground was soft, and it was warm, impossibly, unnervingly warm. For 3 days after finding that first circle, the team pushed north. The mood was a strange mix of scientific excitement and professional focus. They were cartographers, geologists. What they had found was an anomaly, yes, but a geological one. Something to be measured, documented, and understood. On the 4th day, Alexei was on point when he crested a low, gravelly ridge. He stopped dead. Below them, stretching for miles across a vast, swampy basin, the land was covered in them. Not one circle, dozens, maybe hundreds, perfect, dark rings of melted permafrost tattooed onto the face of the earth. They descended from the ridge into the basin, and the world changed. The crisp, cold air of the taiga gave way to a heavy, damp warmth that clung to their clothes. The ground under their boots was spongy, releasing little puffs of steam with every step. Some of the circles were small, like the first one, but others were colossal, well over 100 meters across. Standing in the center of one, you couldn't see where the frozen tundra began again. You were just in a different world, a warm, wet, silent world that shouldn't exist in the heart of Siberia. As Alexei stood near the center of the largest circle, he felt something new. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up through the thick soles of his boots, through his legs, and settled deep in his chest. A hum, so low it was on the edge of perception. And here's where I have to ask you to imagine this. Imagine feeling a faint, deep vibration coming from the core of the planet itself. A hum that seems to have no source and no end. How long could you stand it before that constant thrumming starts to feel like it's inside your own skull? The feeling was unnerving, but the instruments failing, that was terrifying. Dmitri, the meticulous cartographer, was the first to notice. He cursed in frustration, tapping the glass of his compass. The needle was drifting lazily, refusing to lock onto magnetic north. Victor, ever the stoic leader, pulled out his own military-grade compass. He held it flat, watched the needle swing. It settled a full 15 degrees off from Dimitri's. Victor didn't panic. He simply nodded. A large iron deposit, he announced. A major geomagnetic anomaly. It's not unheard of. We will recalibrate our position from solar and stellar readings. It is a complication, nothing more. That night, the anomaly found a new way in. As the team huddled in their tent, Yuri, the radio operator, tried to tune in the nightly broadcast from Yakutsk. He fiddled with the dial, sweeping through the frequencies. But there was no voice, no music, no familiar crackle of a distant station. There was only static, but it wasn't random noise. It was a persistent, low-frequency pulse. A rhythmic like a slow, deep breath, or a heartbeat amplified from the center of the earth. Victor listened for a moment, then waved it away. Atmospheric interference, common in these latitudes. It will clear, but it didn't clear. And later, as Alexei lay in his sleeping bag, the world was filled with two sounds. The pulsing from the radio that Yuri had carelessly left on, and the bone-deep hum that seemed to be vibrating up from the ground itself. Victor's rational explanations echoed in his mind: iron deposits, atmospheric interference. They were logical, they were scientific, but they felt thin. They felt like a story you tell a child who is afraid of the dark. And lying there, in the heart of a phenomenon that defied their maps and silenced their radios, Alexei felt a cold, sharp dread. He was beginning to understand. They were the children, and the dark was very, very real. Imagine being trapped in a metal box with the same 3 people for 6 months. No new faces, no new conversations, no escape. The same jokes start to wear thin. The way someone chews their food becomes a declaration of war. You know that feeling? We've all felt it on a long road trip or a family holiday. Now, multiply that by 1,000. That was the reality for Alexei, Viktor, Dmitry, and Yuri as the Siberian winter began to close its fist around their small research station. The initial excitement of the mission had long since evaporated, replaced by a monotonous, grinding routine. And then, the sound started. It wasn't a sound you could point to. It wasn't the hum of the generator or the wind whistling through the radio mast. This was different. Alexei said it started as a feeling, a vibration he felt in his teeth when he clenched his jaw. Then, it was in his chest. A low, subsonic thrumming that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of his bones. It was the hum they'd felt outside, near the circles, but now it had followed them inside. It never stopped. It was the first thing they felt when they woke up, and the last thing they felt before succumbing to a restless sleep. Dmitry Lisko was the first to break. Dmitry was the team's cartographer, a quiet, meticulous man whose entire world revolved around precision. Angles, measurements, coordinates. His maps were works of art, his handwriting perfect. One evening, as the four of them sat in the common area, the silence thick with the unspoken hum, Dmitry tapped the crystal of his watch. It was a sturdy, state-issued mechanical timepiece. He held it to his ear. Then he looked over at the station's official chronometer on the wall. "Funny," he said, to no one in particular. "It's running slow." Viktor, ever the pragmatist, didn't even look up from his papers. "It's a machine, Dmitry. Wind it." But it wasn't that simple. Alexei saw the look on Dmitry's face. It wasn't the mild annoyance of a faulty device. It was a flicker of genuine, deep-seated fear. A few days later, it was no longer a passing comment. Dmitry's obsession with time became all-consuming. He was constantly winding his watch, then checking it against the wall clock, then against the shortwave time signal from the mainland. He started a new logbook, not for mapping, but for time itself. He'd sit there for hours, his brow furrowed in concentration, logging discrepancies. A lost second here, 3 seconds there. To the others, it was madness. Their watches were fine. The station clock was fine. But to Dmitry, they were all living a lie. Viktor finally had enough. He broke protocol and made a secure call to their command base. He tried to sound calm, professional. He reported Dmitry's behavior, framing it as isolation-induced stress. He mentioned the long winter, the monotony, the psychological strain. Alexei remembered huddling near the radio, listening to the crackle and hiss from a world away. The voice that came back was detached, clinical. "We've reviewed the file, Viktor. It's classic expedition psychosis, cabin fever. It happens. The official recommendation is to increase his workload. Follow the psychological wellness protocols in your manual. Keep him busy." The radio clicked off. They were alone. The diagnosis had been handed down from on high. The monster in the room was just in their heads. At night, Alexei woke to a strange sound. A faint, rhythmic clicking. It wasn't the hum. This was smaller, more deliberate. He got out of his bunk, the cold metal floor shocking his bare feet. The station was on its night cycle, bathed in the ghostly green glow of emergency lights. He followed the sound to the common area, and what he saw froze him in place. Dmitry was sitting at the table, a tiny penlight held between his teeth. In front of him, on a square of black felt, were the guts of his watch. Every tiny gear, every spring, every screw, laid out with surgical precision. He was staring at the disassembled mechanism, his face a mask of desperate concentration. And he was whispering, over and over. "It's not fast enough," he whispered into the humming dark. "It can't keep up." The message came on the 5th week, crackling through the radio with a voice that sounded a million miles away. It was supposed to be a routine check-in, confirmation of the supply helicopter's arrival. But the voice on the other end was apologetic. A weather system, unheard of for the season, had grounded all flights. A delay. 2 weeks, maybe 3. For the men in that hut, it wasn't a delay. It was a sentence. Alexei told me he felt the air in the room change. It became thick, heavy. The vast, empty taiga they had been mapping was no longer a frontier. It was a cage, and the door had just been locked. That evening, the sunset was unnaturally fast. Or at least, it felt that way. The sky bled from pale blue to a bruised, violent purple in what felt like minutes. And that's when Yuri started. He was standing by the window, just staring out at the horizon. Alexei said he heard him whisper at first. No, a soft, confused sound. Then louder. No, it's too soon. He turned from the window, his face pale, his eyes wide with a kind of cosmic terror. It was just midday, he stammered, looking at the others. It was just midday. Where did the hours go? Yuri's confusion curdled into raw panic. He started pacing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't afraid of an animal or the cold. He was afraid of the day itself. It was only a few hours long, he screamed, his voice cracking. It stole the hours. It stole them. He pointed a trembling finger, not at the window, but at the corner of the room. At the radio, the source of that constant, unending static. That, he shrieked, his eyes wild. That sound, it's eating the time. It's making it go faster. He was making a connection that wasn't logical, but in that place, logic had started to feel like a distant memory. Before anyone could stop him, Yuri lunged. He snatched a heavy iron pry bar from their toolkit, and with a guttural roar, he brought it down on the radio. Once, twice, the sound was sickening, a crunch of bakelite, the pop and hiss of shattering vacuum tubes. And then, silence. For the first time in weeks, the low, bone-deep hum of the static was gone. But the quiet that replaced it was infinitely worse. It was a dead, hollow void. It was the sound of their last connection to the world being severed. They were adrift, utterly and completely alone in the vast, silent emptiness. And here's the part that Alexei told me with his voice lowered to a whisper. This is the point of no return. What do you do when your leader, the rock you depend on, begins to crumble? Victor, the stoic, by-the-book commander, didn't yell at Yuri. He didn't try to fix the radio. He just stared at the wreckage with empty eyes. Later that night, Alexei was woken by a faint noise, a scraping sound. He saw Victor in the faint moonlight by the supply pantry. He was quietly, carefully, moving cans of meat into his personal footlocker. Not a lot, just a few, just enough to give him an edge. It wasn't a loud betrayal. It was a quiet, terrifying crack in the foundation of their world. Suddenly, the fear wasn't about the warm circles in the permafrost, or the hum that vibrated through their bones, or even the feeling of time slipping away. The fear was now inside the barracks. It was sitting across the table from them. It was sleeping in the bunk next to them. With Victor's authority shattered and his paranoia laid bare, the team fractured. Dmitri was lost to his watches. Yuri was a ghost haunted by the sun, and Victor. Victor was now just another man trying to survive. Alexei was the only one left who felt sane. And he realized the most terrifying thing of all. The enemy wasn't the landscape. The enemy was what the landscape was turning them into. Then the snow came, not a gentle flurry, but a solid wall of white that descended from a bruised purple sky and erased the world. Alexei said it was like the taiga itself was holding its breath and then exhaled a ghost. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound that scoured the metal walls of their tiny prefabricated barracks. Within hours, they were buried. You know that cozy feeling of being snowed in? This wasn't that. This was the feeling of being entombed. The horizon, the trees, the very ground beneath them, all gone. Swallowed by a blank, howling void. They were now on an island, not of land, but of tin and wood, adrift in an ocean of white. And that's when the hum changed. Before, it was a vibration in the soles of their boots, a deep resonance from the earth. Now, it was inside. The storm seemed to amplify it, trapping it with them in the tiny shelter. It vibrated through the floor plates. It made the tin mugs on the small table tremble. Alexei told me he could feel it in his teeth, a bone-deep thrumming that synchronized with his own pulse. It was no longer a sound you heard, but a pressure you felt. A physical weight in the air that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The silence between gusts of wind wasn't silent at all. It was filled with that low, grinding hum. There was no escape. Victor, their leader, had completely shut down. He sat on his bunk, staring at the wall, occasionally rocking back and forth. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak. He was just a shell. But Dmitri and Yuri, they were the opposite. They were filled with a terrifying, electric energy. They paced the length of the small room, back and forth, their boots thudding a frantic rhythm on the metal floor. They whispered to each other, their heads close together. Alexei would catch fragments. The circles are hungry. The snow is a blanket. It's trapping the sound. The sun is the trigger. They were no longer just scared. They were building a new, terrible kind of logic. Finally, Alexei couldn't take the whispering anymore. He stood up and demanded to know what they were talking about. And they turned to him, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with a horrifying certainty. A shared, unshakable conviction. Yuri spoke first. The circles aren't just warm spots, Alexei. They're sinks. Time sinks. Dmitri nodded, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the cold. They consume it. The hum is the sound of them feeding. Every sunrise, the light hits the permafrost and they open up, and another day gets eaten. That's why the days felt shorter. They shorter. It was the textbook definition of shared psychosis. But their logic was so chillingly complete, so absolute, that for a terrifying second, it almost made sense. And then came their solution. It was Dmitri who said it, his voice a low, urgent hiss. We can't let the sun catch us here. Yuri grabbed his parka from its hook. We had to outrun it. They started pulling on their gear, heavy boots, thick gloves, fur-lined hoods. It wasn't the careful preparation of men heading into a storm. It was a frantic, panicked scramble. They were convinced that if they could just run west, fast enough, they could stay in the night. They could stay ahead of the dawn. They could physically outrun the passage of time itself. They were going to race the rotation of the earth, on foot, in the middle of a Siberian blizzard. Alexei stood between them and the door. He pleaded with them. He told them the blizzard would kill them in minutes. That it was suicide, but they didn't see him. Their eyes were fixed on the door, on the sliver of howling white visible underneath it. To them, the storm wasn't the threat. The storm was an obstacle in their escape from something far, far worse. They saw the blizzard as survivable. But the dawn was an absolute end. And as they pushed past him, their faces grim with purpose, Alexei was left with a choice no human should ever have to make. Let them run to their certain death in the cold? Or try to fight two strong, desperate men who had become utterly convinced that they were running for their lives, from time itself. Alexei lunged for the door handle, but he was too late. The heavy, insulated door swung open, and for a split second, the world outside wasn't a blizzard, it was just white. A flat, featureless, blinding void. Dmitri and Yuri didn't hesitate. They walked into it, side by side, two dark figures against an infinite canvas of nothing. They didn't look back. The wind ripped the door from Alexei's grasp and slammed it shut, plunging the barracks back into dim, yellow light. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The hum stopped. The deep, bone-shaking vibration that had been the soundtrack to their madness for months was just gone. The silence it left behind was louder than any scream. Alexei and Victor didn't speak for the rest of the night. They just sat in that deafening silence, listening to the wind howl, each man trapped in his own private hell. The next morning, the blizzard had passed. The sky was a brutal, unforgiving gray. They didn't dare open the door to look for their friends. They knew what they wouldn't find. And then, a new sound. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. A rhythmic, chopping beat. It wasn't the slow, heavy thrum of their usual supply chopper. This was faster, sharper, military. A dark green Mi-8 helicopter appeared over the horizon, flying low and fast, kicking up a storm of fresh snow as it landed 50 meters from their barracks. The side door of the helicopter slid open and two men in heavy winter gear, but with no unit insignias, jumped out. They didn't call out. They didn't ask if anyone was okay. They moved with a grim purpose, their faces hidden by scarves and goggles. One of them banged on the door. "Volkov, Orlov, emergency extraction. You have 5 minutes." It wasn't a rescue. It was an order. Alexei told me they weren't treated like survivors. They were treated like evidence. Contaminated evidence that needed to be secured. They were bundled into the cold metal interior of the chopper, and as it lifted off, Alexei looked down at the single, muddy circle near their camp, a dark brown scar on a perfectly white world. They weren't taken to a hospital. They were flown to a nameless concrete facility deep in the Urals. For 2 weeks, they were kept in separate, identical rooms. Windowless, white walls, a bed, a table, a chair. The debriefings were relentless. Men in plain clothes asked the same questions over and over. They never wrote anything down. At the end, they were brought into a room together and presented with a stack of documents. Non-disclosure agreements, an official report. The report stated that cartographer Dmitry Lisko and surveyor Yuri Sokolov were tragically lost after wandering into a sudden blizzard. Their bodies never recovered. Can you imagine that? Surviving that? That temporal hell, only to have your entire reality officially erased by men in unmarked uniforms holding a pen? Alexei and Viktor signed. What choice did they have? They were given new assignments in different corners of the Soviet Union and never saw each other again. The project was scrubbed from the records. The warm circles in the taiga officially didn't exist. That was 40 years ago. Now, we're back in the present, sitting in Alexei's small apartment. He's an old man now, but his eyes are sharp with a fear that has never faded. He turns his laptop towards me. On the screen is a recent satellite photograph of the exact same region. It took him decades to get the coordinates right. Where there was once just one circle, now there are thousands. The land is pockmarked with them. A brown, festering disease spreading across the permafrost, visible from space. Alexei closes the laptop. He tells me he knows what they are. They're wounds, openings, but to where or when, he doesn't dare to guess. He says he still has nightmares, but not of the cold or the isolation or the faces of his lost friends. He tells me the thing that wakes him up, sweating, heart pounding in the dead of night, is the sound of a ticking clock. A simple, mundane sound, because in his dreams, he can hear it slowing down. And he knows, with a certainty that chills him to his very soul, that one day it's going to stop. And he has no idea what happens after that. And the most terrifying part? The satellite images are real. The phenomenon is spreading. And whatever happened to those 4 men in the 1980s, it might just be the beginning.